Show. Alrighty, welcome back in. It is the Zach Gelb Show on the Infinity Sports Network. It is a sad day today here for our network. Obviously, we were once called CBS Sports Radio, and a part of the original lineup was John Feinstein, the legendary writer, and so many best-selling books, and he was a host here on the network at the inception of the network. We found out right before we started the show today that unfortunately he passed away at the age of 68, and I know John entertained you, many of you listeners, for so many years through his show, through his articles, through his books. And I always remember listening to his sports minutes. You know, I talked about this with Ack. And, you know, when the network did launch, and I'm someone that grew up with New York radio roots, so I would always listen to WFAN with Mike and the Mad Dog, Imus, Boomer and Craig, you know, the 3,000 midday shows that they had at WFAN. But when I heard about the network, you know, I it's crazy that I've hosted here for so many years now, but I tuned in as a fan. And obviously, like, Rome is a huge, credible name, and he was always a different entity compared to the network. But I remember when the network launched, I heard the name John Feinstein, and for me, that was like a huge, credible name for CBS Sports Radio. And unfortunately, John passed away today. We found out at the age of 68. Andrew Bogusch, our colleague, was very close with John, and he's kind enough to join us for a few minutes. Bogues, I know tough circumstances today, but appreciate you doing this. My condolences, and thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, Zach, thanks for having me. Certainly a crappy day for all of us, for the many people that knew John, worked with John, loved or hated John, and for all of us at the network, too. I mean, I can't believe that the show was 12, 13 years ago. It's a long time has passed since John was on the air, but you know, I was sitting here laughing, you mentioning his sports minutes, because we always knew when they aired back in the day, because that usually was when our Twitter handle got the busiest, with people mostly yelling at John in disagreement with those sports minutes.
Yeah, and I'll like peel back the curtain a little bit on the sports minutes. Like, I don't write much. Right, I sit down, I do the show, I give you the take, and you know, whatever comes out of my mouth, that's just the way. They were
also
goes.
Actual sports minutes back then. Now they're 23 seconds.
Now they're even tougher. But like, you write those, and then you have to read them. And I never liked the whole writing and then you know, read, you know, what you're saying to the audience. But it's to no surprise, and I don't know John's entire process, but we know how legendary of a writer he was. You know, you may have not liked what he had to say, you may not have agreed with it, but it was a purposeful minute that he actually gave you, where it was always something that it's crazy how 1 minute can stick with people for a while with what John was able to do.
Oh yeah, I mean, he did not skimp on a minute. You got 50 seconds of thought. Again, it might have been irrational. It might have been something completely against your belief system. But he brought it to you. Now, to really pull the curtain back, he was surprisingly not good at facts in those sports minutes.
Wow.
So the guys in our newsroom who had to cut that, and not usually, you know, you got to trim it down, get it to the right time frame, but you can trust that what's in there is right. But John gave them an extra layer of work because, you know, a year might be wrong. It might have been 89, not 98. It might have been George, not Gary, somebody's first name. He was kind of like an absent-minded professor. And for everything that he knew, sometimes the facts got scrambled on their way out, and they needed fixing.
Andrew Bogusch here with us. I remember one of our own, John Feinstein, unfortunately passed away today at the age of 68. So I knew you guys worked together. I knew you guys were close. I didn't know that he actually brought you to the network. Tell me about that.
Yeah, he was at he and I, me longer, but we were both at Sirius XM before the network started. And I had kind of it was a new venture. Our old boss, Eric Spitz, who was the head of our network and WFAN, you know, I had pestered him for a long time for different jobs. And then this one popped up, and somebody else had said, hey, you should send your tape to Spitz because he's hiring for this new network. So I had kind of already started to apply, so to speak. But then John got the midday show, kind of the mid-morning. It was 9 a.m. to noon Eastern, and I had filled in. John was doing a show at Sirius with Bruce Murray, another good friend of mine who is still there at Sirius, and a couple of times Bruce had been out, and I filled in for John enough to make an impression, and John liked working with me, and the idea was to find somebody to be with him, not a co-host, but just somebody to be else also be in the room. And I don't know how many other people were involved. I don't know if I was the first or the eighth choice, but I know that John was when my name was presented to John, he was he okayed me coming aboard. So yeah, I mean, it was not like, hey, let's go together. But I don't know that I would have been there if he wasn't the person who got hired to do that 3 hour slot.
So from the early days of the network, when you would tune in to a John Feinstein show and you being there and being a part of the show, kind of describe to the listener that maybe wasn't familiar with John's legendary career and they're tuning in today, what you would kind of get on a John Feinstein show.
I mean, you would get a guy who knew everybody and had an opinion on everything, which at times was taxing because like there were things that, we'd be like, why does this bother you? How did you know about this to then have an opinion on it? But that's why he was good at writing, and that's why he was good on the radio as a guest and as a host, because he always had something to say. He knew people, and he was a journalist in the truest sense of the word. So, when he thought about something and kind of fleshed out an argument, he would talk to people who could help or refute what he was thinking. Like, everything was done correctly and deeply and processed. And sometimes it was crazy. Like, I mean, there were times where we couldn't believe what he was talking about or couldn't have disagreed more with his take on things. But nothing was mailed in. Nothing was at 50%. Everything was full speed. Everything was 100%. It could be good. It could be bad. It could be annoying. It could be genius. It could have been all of those things for everybody listening. But you got a lot in 3 hours. You got some complaints. You got some whining. You got some good thoughts. You got some bad thoughts. You got some great interviews. It was a lot. It was a show that definitely was unique. It wasn't always for everybody. It wasn't all. John, I think, had kind of geographical borders to a certain extent, where he played best and where he didn't, based on his thoughts on a lot of things. But it was a good radio show. I thought it served its purpose for those 3 hours. You didn't know what you were gonna get when you started the show. It could be something crazy political, or it could be a 90-minute Dean Smith kind of retrospective. It could have been anything. And on most days, I thought it was pretty fun.
And you know what? Usually this time of the year, I think of John Feinstein, because I remember especially his interviews in college basketball season with March Madness. Those were always a treat to listen to.
I mean, it took some getting used to. Obviously, I knew who he was long before I ever met him at Sirius and before I came to CBS to work with him. So I knew who he was, but to be next to him for those 2+ years, seeing it in reality, it was shocking. Like, the amount of people, really, really significant, important people in college basketball in particular, college football as well, that wanted to talk to him, that sought him out. I mean, I sat with him one year when the NCAA tournament was at Madison Square Garden, and he was on the phone with I can't name out loud, but a prominent college basketball coach giving him advice on another job, leaving the current one he had to go take one at a bigger conference. And this person had called him to get his opinion on whether he should leave school A for school B.
Wow.
And if I remember correctly, he stayed where he was because that was part of John's argument. So like that's how significant he was. Coach K, Dean Smith, Jim Valvano, but like these people opened up to him like nobody else. I mean, it's starting with the Bob Knight book that made John who he was, that started this legendary Hall of Fame career. The deference that legends had for him, and the fanboying sometimes that these legends had of him, it never got old, and it was always surprising.
So give me the story, because I saw your tweet when you were remembering your friend John Feinstein, who unfortunately passed away today at the age of 68. Coach K once prank called you?
So obviously John and Coach K are very close, because John went to Duke and then covered Duke and ACC basketball for the entire time before Coach K was even there, before he was Coach K. So Coach he came up often on the show and came on the show once or twice, and that led me to start saying that Coach liked me more than John. that we were the better friends, not him and John. So one day, all of a sudden, he takes a phone call out of nowhere and he says, "Hey, I think this is Mike in North Carolina's on the phone." And it's Krzyzewski
Wow.
calling me Arnold Bogus instead of Andrew Bogusch and saying how tight we are. And I mean, I still have it. I still can't believe it. Fast forward a couple of years later, Coach K is in our building promoting, I think, a book. And I introduced myself to him. He had no memory of this, no recollection. There's a picture of me holding up one of John's books with Coach K in the hallway right outside of where you're sitting right now. And he has no idea why any of this is funny, why I'm talking to him. And it's one of my favorite moments ever. And it happened because of John. And Coach K called in out of nowhere. So he's still being Coach K and decided to mess with me for 15 minutes for fun.
That's awesome. Andrew Bogusch here with us. So I'm reading this tweet. Give me the Brad Stevens story. Brad Stevens got mad at you. Is that true?
So Brad Stevens came on as Butler head coach Brad Stevens.
Yeah.
And John, and I need to preface this, like John didn't have to let me talk to these people when they came on the show.
Because usually when you have like a solo host, you don't usually hear from update anchors or the behind the scenes people while the guests are on.
I was not the co-host of the show by definition. There was nothing in a contract. There was nothing in it. I was not the co-host of the show, but
you kind of were, really.
But I was on the show a lot, almost like a co-host, and he let me interview these people with him. And when Brad Stevens came on as the Butler coach before we went to the Celtics, I was trying to ask him a question about what he can't do at Butler in terms of like recruiting and stuff like that. And it was delivered poorly. Just from a structure standpoint, I didn't say it confidently. And I think he was insulted that I was kind of knocking Butler, which was not my intention. We were just trying to explain, in my mind, like walk us through how Butler's not Duke, how Butler's not North Carolina, like what's the biggest obstacle to success at Butler. And so he was perturbed. I don't think he was that mad in the moment, but it became a running thing that I had angered Brad Stevens on the show. Fast forward to the Final Four in Atlanta, and John and I and our producer Max Herman are walking between a hotel and a restaurant, I guess, and we see Brad Stevens and Mrs. Stevens walking down the street towards us, and Brad right away shakes John's hand, "How you doing?" And John goes, "And this is Andrew." And Brad had known about the running joke, and he just looks at me and walks right past us with his wife. Doesn't say a word, doesn't shake his hand, turns around, laugh, and everything's fine. But like in the middle of this, but again, this is Brad Stevens, Butler head coach, and he's on the street messing with me again because of John.
It's wild, especially the impact that he had in the college basketball community. Give me one more, because I see the tweet and I'm not familiar with the story. You almost got fired over something with Frank Vogel?
Yeah, this is a bad one. So John, one of John's many things as a host, and you know this because you just came back from the Super Bowl. John, with every fiber of his being, hated sponsored guest interviews. If you were coming on and you were selling laundry detergent or a sneaker or a sports drink, you weren't coming on. Like we turned down too many people because we had to mention Clorox or something along the way. And this particular one, Frank Vogel, I guess, was in between. He had just gotten fired by the Pacers, maybe. And Frank Vogel was in the news. It would have been a coup to have Frank Vogel on promoting Vidal Sassoon shampoo, and John wouldn't do it because of the promo attached to it. And here's where I made a mistake. I could have, and I did say to him, like, I think you're making a mistake. We need to have Frank Vogel on the show because he's in the news right now. And John wouldn't do it, and he wouldn't budge because he was a man of principles. And I couldn't give up the fight because, frankly, I was nervous about, I didn't know where the show was going to go. And we were year to year, all the shows on the network early kind of were fighting for their lives.
Yeah. So
I wanted to have Frank Vogel on for the good of the show so people would write up these stories of Frank Vogel told John Feinstein this. And so I kind of passive-aggressively mentioned to our boss that Frank Vogel was no longer coming on the show. So then our boss got angry and went back to John and said, "You need to have Frank Vogel on." And that led to a very a kind of come to Jesus moment at John's Pizza near the studio about we got to do when it matters because John's name is on the show. We have to do things the way John wants to, and in particular, pseudo going behind his back was not the best course of business by me, and he was 100% right then, and he's still right now. Although we should have had Frank Vogel on, I was right about that part.
The stories are great. If you had to look back at your time here working with him, like years later, and I know it's tough to do on today when we find out when he passed away, John Feinstein at the age of 68, but Bogues, like how do you look back on that time together with him working here, launching this new network?
I mean, it was great. We went to 2 Super Bowls, went to 2 Final Fours. I met all of these ridiculously famous people, and like John's ridiculously famous. He is an all-timer. From his books to the Washington Post, I mean, he is an all-timer, and he liked me. And I don't. You
don't know why?
I don't take. No, I mean, I'm fairly cool.
Yeah.
I don't take that. I don't take that lightly though. Like he didn't like a lot of people. And a lot of people didn't like him. And I liked him and he liked me and we got along. And I appreciate the fact that, he picked up the phone whenever I called and he called me on his own. And he still called me Arnold up until, thanks to Coach K, up until our last conversation last month. Our daughters are the same age. We trade holiday cards. I mean, he's a legitimate friend. And I had 15 of his books before meeting him. And now I think I have all of them because I bought both of them to kind of kiss up to him along the way. So again, I just, I've got a lot of cool things because of him, and I can't ever repay him for that, and I can't ever thank him enough for that.
Well, well said. Obviously, Bogues, I wish we were having you on under better circumstances, but appreciate you giving us a few minutes today to remember your friend John Feinstein, who obviously so many people know in the sports world, and many of our listeners know when the network first launched. Who unfortunately passed away today at the age of 68. Thank you, Bogues.
No, thank you, Zach. I appreciate the time.